There is a moment in life when the noise fades, when support disappears, when the world feels distant and the path becomes quiet. Most people fear this moment, but Machiavelli understood something darker. Isolation is not always lost. Sometimes it is a transformation. When a person stands alone, they stop performing. They stop begging. They stop depending. They begin to see clearly. This is not about cruelty. It is about self-possession. Because the one who can survive without validation becomes psychologically untouchable. And that is where danger begins. It rarely begins with drama. There is no sudden collapse, no loud ending. It begins with silence, a message unanswered, a phone that stops lighting up, a world that continues moving while support quietly fades. At first, the mind searches for explanations. Everyone is busy. It will return. This is temporary. But time passes, and the silence remains. This is the first emotional shock of standing alone. Not the absence of people, but the absence of reassurance. In the absence of someone saying, "You're doing well." The absence of warmth that once softened uncertainty. Solitude arrives not as a choice, but as exposure. Without witnesses, the self becomes louder. Every doubt sharpens. Every effort feels heavier because it is carried without echo. Most people interpret this silence as abandonment. They assume it means that something is wrong with them, that they are invisible, that they are forgotten. But psychologically, this is where reality begins. Machiavelli understood that dependence is weakness, not because connection is wrong, but because reliance makes the mind controllable. The person who needs support becomes ruled by its absence. So the first silence becomes a test, not of strength, but of identity. Who is someone when no one is watching? Human beings are wired for feedback. Approval regulates emotion. Recognition gives effort meaning. When those signals vanish, the nervous system becomes restless. This is why standing alone feels unnatural. But Machiavelli would call it clarity, because silence reveals something honest. Support was never guaranteed. And once the mind accepts that no one is coming to carry the weight, something shifts. Responsibility becomes personal. Effort becomes self-contained. This is not strength yet. It is exposure. But inside exposure, transformation begins. Standing alone does not destroy someone. It reveals them. And that is the first step toward becoming dangerous. Dependence does not begin in adulthood. It begins early. A child learns what safety feels like through response. A smile becomes reassurance. Attention becomes comfort. Being seen becomes stability. Over time, the nervous system links worth with feedback. Do well, and someone notices. Struggle, and someone steps in. Move forward, and someone encourages. This is not weakness. It is human development. The brain is shaped socially. People learn who they are through mirrors, through being acknowledged, guided, supported. So dependence becomes invisible. It does not feel like reliance. It feels like normal life. But as years pass, the pattern evolves. In adulthood, support becomes validation, recognition from friends, approval from authority, reassurance from relationships. The mind begins to expect witnesses. Effort feels more meaningful when someone observes it. Pain feels lighter when someone shares it. Progress feels real when someone confirms it. This is why isolation hurts so deeply, because the mind is not only experiencing the present absence, it is experiencing the collapse of an old expectation. Machiavelli understood that those who rely too heavily on others become vulnerable, not emotionally fragile, but psychologically dependent. The person who needs constant reassurance becomes controlled by silence, because silence becomes interpretation. Am I failing? Am I forgotten? Am I alone for a reason? This is the hidden root of discomfort, not loneliness itself, but the belief that being alone means being wrong. Standing alone interrupts conditioning. It forces the mind to locate strength internally instead of externally, and that is destabilizing. Because something familiar is being removed, and something deeper has not yet fully formed. But this removal is not punishment. It is preparation, because once dependence is exposed, The foundation for true self-reliance begins, and Machiavelli's darkest truth appears. Those who cannot stand alone will always be at the mercy of those who can. When support disappears, the mind does not collapse immediately. It reorganizes. At first, the absence feels heavy. Without validation, effort feels uncertain. Without reassurance, doubt grows louder. Without witnesses, progress feels invisible. But psychologically, something profound begins to happen. The brain starts searching inward. No longer guided by applause or feedback, it begins building internal reference points. This is where self-reliance begins, not as confidence, but as necessity. Psychology describes this shift as moving from an external locus of control to an internal one. When a person depends on others for meaning, their emotions rise and fall with response. When they rely on themselves, emotion becomes steadier, not because pain disappears, but because direction no longer depends on approval. The nervous system adapts. It learns to regulate without external soothing. Disappointment is processed internally. Uncertainty is held without panic. Silence becomes survivable. This is the beginning of quiet strength. Machiavelli understood that power belongs to those who are not easily moved. The person who needs little becomes harder to control, because anything that can provoke dependence can steer behavior. Self-reliance breaks that chain. The mind starts measuring progress differently, not by recognition, but by consistency, not by attention, but by continuity. This is uncomfortable because it removes emotional cushioning. There is no one to soften failure, no one to amplify success. Yet clarity forms here. Motivation becomes quieter, but more durable. It is no longer fueled by being seen, but by being aligned. Self-reliance is not isolation. It is internal structure, a steady center that can move forward even when effort feels unseen. And slowly, almost unnoticed, the person learns something essential. Standing alone does not weaken them. It grounds them. And in that grounding, danger begins to take shape, not as cruelty, but as psychological independence. Knowing that solitude can create strength does not make it easy. The body still reacts. The mind still urges retreat. Standing alone interrupts everything familiar. There's an instinct to reach outward, to explain, to seek reassurance, to wait until someone notices before continuing. This resistance is not laziness. It is fear disguised as longing. Fear of failing in silence. Fear that effort without recognition is meaningless. Fear that being alone means being wrong. Psychologically, this phase is marked by conflict. One part of the self pushes forward. Another part hesitates. Comparison emerges here. The mind looks outward and notices those who are supported. Their path appears smoother. Their progress seems lighter. Resentment forms quietly. Why them? Why not me? This comparison deepens resistance because it reinforces an illusion. That success is supposed to be witnessed. That hardship alone is a mistake. At the same time, doubt becomes subtle, not loud self-hatred, but hesitation, delays, second-guessing. The effort slows, not because ability is missing, but because permission is still being unconsciously sought. This is the most fragile stage. Many stop here, not because they fail, but because they retreat toward comfort. They interpret silence as a signal to pause. But the pause does not bring relief. It prolongs dependence. Machiavelli would call this the moment where weakness reveals itself, not in poverty, but in hesitation, because the world does not reward those who wait for approval. Standing alone is uncomfortable because it removes emotional buffers, but it also removes distraction. And in this discomfort, clarity begins to sharpen. The question changes, not who will support this, but will I continue even if no one does? And once that question is asked honestly, the mind begins preparing for a different answer. The turning point does not announce itself. There is no surge of confidence, no dramatic decision. It arrives as a subtle release. The mind stops checking for response. stops measuring effort by reaction, stops waiting for acknowledgement before moving forward. Nothing outside changes. The silence remains. Support still does not arrive. But internally, the meaning of that silence shifts. What once felt like abandonment becomes neutral. Not rejection, not failure, just absence. And in that neutrality, tension dissolves. Energy that was once spent hoping, explaining, resenting, returns inward. Attention stabilizes. Movement becomes quieter, but more consistent. Psychologically, this is recalibration. Expectation dissolves. With it, disappointment loses its grip. Effort becomes self-contained, no longer performed for an audience, no longer delayed by hesitation. The mind recognizes that progress does not require witnesses, only continuation. There is relief here, not the relief of being helped, but the relief of no longer needing help. Machiavelli understood that dependence is a kind of vulnerability. The person who needs approval becomes predictable. The person who releases it becomes untouchable. The internal dialogue changes. Instead of asking, "Why is no one supporting this?" the mind asks, "What is the next step?" This shift is irreversible. Once expectation is released, dependency cannot return in the same form. Support, if it comes later, is received as addition, not necessity. At this point, resilience is no longer reactive. It is structural. The nervous system settles into steadier rhythm. Setbacks lose their personal weight. This is not detachment from goals. It is detachment from validation. And that detachment creates clarity. The person continues not because they feel strong, but because stopping no longer makes sense. This is Machiavelli's turning point, when power returns inward, when silence becomes strength, and progress becomes owned. With time, what once felt like endurance begins to feel natural. The absence of support no longer registers as loss. It becomes part of the environment, unchanging, neutral, expected. This is where integration begins. Psychologically, the mind stabilizes when it no longer scans for reinforcement. Emotional energy evens out. High expectations and deep disappointments soften into steadier rhythms. The nervous system learns something important. It can regulate itself. Without constant external input, emotions are processed internally. Disappointment is felt without spiraling. Uncertainty is held without panic. Success is experienced without the need for validation. This is healing, not because pain disappears, but because it no longer controls direction. Identity also changes. When progress is built without help, self-image becomes quieter and more grounded. There is less need to announce, less urgency to prove, less attachment to comparison. Confidence forms differently here, not as boldness, but as stability, not as certainty, but as tolerance for uncertainty. This internal structure allows movement regardless of circumstance. Energy is conserved. Focus deepens. Support, if it appears later, is welcomed, but not relied upon. It enhances movement rather than enabling it. There is compassion in this stage. For the earlier self who waited. For others who still do. Understanding replaces bitterness. Perspective replaces resentment. Silence is no longer interpreted as judgment. It is simply silence. And within that quiet, effort becomes sustainable. Machiavelli's darkest strength is not cruelty. It is independence. Healing is not becoming harder. It is becoming less dependent, less reactive, less fragile, more present. This integration does not make success louder. It makes it sturdier, built not on approval, but on continuity. In the end, standing alone does not create noise. It creates quiet, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of self-possession. There is no final applause, no moment where the world suddenly understands. What remains is something calmer than recognition, a person who no longer waits to be seen. Machiavelli understood that the most powerful people are not those who dominate, but those who cannot be moved, the one who does not beg, the one who does not overreact, the one who does not collapse in silence. This is the dangerous kind of peace, not aggression, not coldness, but psychological untouchability. The person continues without needing permission. Effort becomes internal. Identity becomes stable. The world's approval becomes optional. Silence is no longer feared. It becomes space. And in that space, clarity grows. Most conflicts lose power when they meet no desperation. Most people lose influence when they cannot provoke need. This is why Machiavelli would call solitude a kind of transformation. Because the one who stands alone stops being controlled externally. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop chasing reassurance. They become difficult to manipulate because nothing essential is being asked for. This is not cruelty. It is freedom. A mind that no longer depends becomes a mind that cannot be easily shaken. The world may still misunderstand. Support may still not arrive, but it no longer dictates direction. What remains is presence. A calm center. A person who has outgrown the need to be carried. Standing alone does not make someone loud. It makes them solid. And solidity is rare. That is why it is dangerous. Not because it harms others, but because it cannot be broken by absence. This is Machiavelli's deepest lesson beneath the darkness. The strongest power is internal. The person who stands alone becomes free. And freedom, when grounded, is the most untouchable strength of all.